Everybody.
Kavod Harav, how are you?
Hashem, thank you.
So we're going now to Hay because we did Dalet yesterday. So it says a bit Yosef here. Katab Rambam. The Rambam writes, Perkei, in Perkei, Im Abra, Velasha, Tachat Hashemesh, if she transgressed and she did the kneading under the sun, right, in the sunlight, or Shelot Sinana Yadea Pat Mutar, or she didn't cool off her hands, as we mentioned yesterday, the bread is allowed to eat anyway, B'diabad. וכתב הרב המגיד שיש חולקים בדבר. So said Rav Magid, there are those who argue with this, this Rambam. And והוא נתן טעם לדברי הרמב"ם. So he says, he gave a reason for the Rambam, his reasoning. אבל דעת הראש בסוף פרק כל שעה לאסור בעברה בלשת תחת השמש. But he says the Rosh, on the other hand, says that if you kneaded the dough under the sun, you cannot eat that, right? Even b'diavad, it's forbidden. That's what the Rosh says. Okay, so we have a machloket dispute between the Rambam and the Rosh. So that's the Bet Yosef. Yeah. Okay, so we'll go to the Shulchan Aruch. So again, right, it says Shulchan Aruch, Avra ve'lasha tachat hashemesh, says the Shulchan Aruch, if she transgressed and she kneaded the dough under the sunlight, hapat muteret, right? So the bread is allowed to eat. So in other words, we go like the Rambam, not like the Rosh, because the Rosh said it's not. So that's the situation, right? He goes like the Rambam. That it's allowed, but diavad, if you did that mistake, and you needed it under the sun. Okay. Good. So I think that's the end of the chapter. No, there's more. Okay. Yeah, there's more. Okay, so let's go back to the Bet Yosef. So this is Vav. It says like this, Katuva Tumat Edeshin, right? It says Bet Yosef. It's written in Tumat Edeshin, כשלשים עיסת פסח למצות, ולפעמים מוסיפים מים בקמח יותר מן הראוי. So he says, what about if you're kneading the dough, right, for Passover, and you put a little bit too much water right in there? So, ולאו שפיר דמה להוסיף קמח לתוך הלישה, כדי שתהיה עיסה כראוי. לפי שהקמח שמוסיפין אין עוד נילוש ונגבל יפה, ונשאר מעט בעין בתוך העיסה, ואפילו לאחר אפייה עודנו בעין, ושמן לא נאפה אותו קמח יפה, ויש לחוש שמא ייפול במרק בקערה ויתחמץ. Wow, interesting. Okay, so let me read that again. One more time. So it says like this, that as we said, right, what's the problem over here? Sometimes you add too much water. And he says it's not proper to do that. to add too much water. So the question is why, right? What's the problem? Uh, so he says the problem is that it's not proper to add water to the dough when you're doing the actual kneading. כדי שתהיה עיסה כראוי, לפי שהקמח שמוסיפין אינו נילוש ונגבל יפה. I'm sorry, no, I didn't read it right. One more time, please. Give me one more chance. Okay, so we'll just reread that again. I don't think I got it right. So again, right? He brings a Trumat edition, who says, right, that you add too much water sometimes to the dough. ולאו שפיר דמה להוסיף קמח. ולפעמים מוסיפים מים מקמח יותר מראוי. Oh, yeah. So he says the improper thing to do, he says, is to add too much flour when you're kneading. Why is that? So he says that flour that you add, it's not going to get kneaded well, right? So what does that mean? It's going to like stay undissolved, and therefore it's just going to stay the way it is. It won't get dissolved in the water. And so the problem is like this, right? That flour that you leave over, and it didn't get really kneaded into the dough properly because you put the flour at the wrong time, or you put too much, whatever, right? So the problem is that it'll stay the way it is, and this is going to come to leaven like that. ושמן לא נאפה אותו קמח יפה, ויש לחוש שמן ייפול במרחק בקערה. So he says the problem is like this, right? That we're afraid that flour will fall into, let's say some soup, whatever, right? In a bowl, and it'll get leavened. So here's the problem, right? It's like an eventuality here, It's not something which happens right away. The problem is that when you have flour which is left inside the dough and didn't get dissolved with the water, the problem is, as we said, right, that then if you take that matzah and there's still some flour there on the surface, whatever there, which hasn't been dissolved, or it's inside the dough itself, it's inside there, it hasn't been dissolved, so it may fall in to your soup and become leavened. That's what he's saying. Because it was really never kneaded properly. This is the problem. Okay. So he says, ונראה דדי בסברה זו ליישב המנהג שנהגו העולם להיזהר אם היה אפשר בלי שיהיה תעיסה, טוב לדוש עוד עיסה אחרת קטנה מגיבול קשה ביבשות תמיד לפי הערך ויערב אותו עם העיסה המלוכלכת שנתוסף בה מים ויקבלו זו מזו לחלוכית ויבשות עד שיגיע שניהם למידה בינונית. So he says, he gives you like a solution here, some kind of a right thing here, like some kind of a strategy here to avoid this problem. So he says, we have like a custom that, that is done. And the custom is that they make like two doughs, not only one. So what does that mean? That it says if there's enough time for you to make another dough, and before it comes to leaven the first dough, if there's a time for you to make another one, so then and do a small one, he says, and make it like very hard. not very soft, not a lot of water in there. And it says, because then what's going to be is, right, when you need to, right, if you need to mix that in, um, if you need to mix it in together with the dough, which is more moistened, right? So in other words, he's telling you there's a custom they used to have like this. Again, right? To repeat, they had they had one moist dough, right, which is your regular dough. They had one hard dough, which was like a brick. I'm exaggerating, right? It was hard, right? Not very, right? Not a lot of water in there. So what they would do is, if they needed to, right, if in the time of need, they would mix up those two. And so they're going to get mixed together, right? The hard one and the soft one. Okay. So what's going to be is, right, that this way it'll come to like a compromise. It won't be too hard, it won't be too soft. In other words, he's giving you here a solution, an interesting solution, whatever, right? But this is not his idea. He says the custom is like this by the people who bake. They make two doughs, one hard, one soft, and just in case, right, that one of them turns out to be, too extreme, so they mixed, right? They put in some of the, from the other one in order to balance it out and make it like, balanced. Okay, I did the best I could to explain that, right? So if you have any questions, let me know. Okay, so that's the Beit Yosef. So let's see the Shulchan Aruch. So it says in the Shulchan Aruch, Ima Isaraka, right? So it says, right, if the dough is soft, lo yosif kemach, right? So don't make the mistake. What's the mistake? Of adding flour to it. You don't want that, right? So you may think, yeah, why not? Let's add some flour and we'll make it a little bit harder because it's too soft right now, right? Um, so as we said, right, what's the reason why we don't want to do that? We don't want to add flour because what happens is that some of the flour may not be dissolved. It's going to stay like raw flour, and then when you put it in your soup, you're going to get chametz there. There's a concern about that, right? And this is the reason, by the way, some Ashkenazim, they have this custom, right? They don't eat, something which is they call gebrochts, in Yiddish, right? What does that mean, gebrochts? That they don't eat matzah that baked the matzah already baked that was soaked in any kind of liquid, let's say in soup, whatever, right? So a lot of the Ashkenazim, they don't eat that, and this is the reason why, because they're concerned, but maybe there's a part of the matzah that wasn't baked well. It's still raw, and then when you put it into your soup, it'll get leavened at that point. But the Rambam says not like that, right? The Rambam says there's no concern. He says once the matzah is once the matzah is baked, there's no concern about leavening anymore. And that's the way the Sephardim go. We Sephardim, we're not concerned about that. So therefore, we put our matzot right into the soup, right, in the chicken soup, right, whatever, right, all that stuff. We have no issues with that. We have no problem with that. A lot of the Ashkenazim, they don't do it. Sometimes when you go to like if you go like to Israel, in like a kosher hotel, so they advertise, right? If you go for Passover, right, they advertise no gebrochts, So in other words, they're not using any soaked matzah. So this is the reason why they advertise that, because a lot of the Ashkenazim, they're stringent about that. Okay, it's a stringency, But here, what we're saying is not really, it's like halacha. So what does that mean? The halacha is telling you, if your dough is too soft, right, you put too much water in there, don't add flour to it. That's not the way to do it. So then what's the solution, right? If it came out too soft, too wet, right, whatever. So it says, Ela osei isa kitana megibul kashe ve'arvena ima isaraka. So what you should do is, right, have your other dough right there, which is the hard one, right? So just in case you need to add some of that hard dough to the soft dough, right, in order to balance it out, you can do it that way, But we don't want you to put straight ahead, flour into that soft dough. That we don't want. Once you already kneaded it, right? Once you start kneading it, we don't want that. Okay, so I hope you got it. So the Rama here adds a little bit one more detail. Says Rama, "V'archika matzot me'akemach." So he says, distance the matzot, right, from the flour. He says, interesting. Why is that? Put a distance between them. So he says the same thing, right? The same idea as we just mentioned. This is another variation of the same theme, which is that what happens is, right, that if that flour falls, right, on the matzah, it'll stick to it, and then you're going to soak it in the water, and it's going to become that leavened. So therefore, right, says the Rama, keep a distance, between the flour and the matzah. This way, you won't have any problems. Okay, good. So I think that's the end of the chapter. Yes, it is. Okay. So I guess we'll go to the next chapter. Any questions? Let me know. Okay. Otherwise, we'll go on. Okay. Okay. So now we're going to Taf Samech, right? Which is 460. Okay. So we'll start the tour here. It says, "En osin hamatzot al yedei akum." Oh, חירש שוטה וקטן, ואחי איתה בשלטות לשם עכו"ם, לשע עכו"ם לישא, או חירש שוטה וקטן, דלאו בני שימונינו, אף על גב דאפיה ישראל בר דת, ועבד בה שימור בשעת אפייה, לה נפיק בה ידי חובתו. Okay, so what is he saying over here? He says, right, that don't use a goy or right deaf mute person who's retarded or whatever, a katan, a child, right? So all these people, right, we don't use them to bake matzot, he says. So what's the issue there, right? Because when it comes to these three categories, right, the problem is that they don't have intellect. Right? When it comes to the goy, he has intellect, but the problem is he doesn't have intention. Like, what does that mean? Intention for the mitzvah. So therefore, you can't do it with a goy. In other words, with probably talking here about the matzot for the mitzvah of the seder night, right? Because that requires intention. So therefore, you can't use a goy for that, since the goy cannot create the scenario of mitzvah intention, right? No such a thing by him. He doesn't know what a mitzvah is, right? He doesn't abide by that. Doesn't have the right. He's not eligible. So therefore, right, we can't use him. The other three that we just mentioned, the problem with them is they have no intellect. So when there's no intellect, there's also no intention. So this is the problem with these things. As opposed to a woman, by the way, which is fine. Because they have intellect, and they're Jewish, so we got no problems with that. That's why you see, right, a lot of ladies who are working in the matzah factories, they have no problem taking ladies over there. Right? When you see the ladies in the matzah factories, right, you see they're usually wearing like a skull cap, like to cover their hair because they don't want their hair, getting into the dough, right? So Usually, they're wearing a skull cap. It looks like a surgery room, like they're doing surgery there, something like that. Okay, so that's the way it is, right? Good. So, right, it says the tour also, right? Another thing, which I didn't mention, that they can't really guard it, right? It's really the same thing. They can't guard the matzah, because we require, right, for the mitzvah that the matzah should be guarded, shmura, right? And they cannot do that because they don't have intention, as we said, right? So he says, even if, right, afterwards, after the goy or whatever, or these three categories, right, of people, they needed the matzah, and then a Jew baked it, right? It's still not good. The fact that the Jew baked it doesn't help you. So, you still got a problem. Okay. So he says, even though the Jew guarded it during the baking, right? That doesn't help you. That's what he's saying, right? So you can't fulfill your obligation with matzah like that. This is the problem. So if you want to fulfill your obligation, right, you have to have somebody who can guard the matzot. So that means he requires intention, requires intellect, requires right intention, so forth, so on. That's the idea. Okay, so that's what it says in the Torah. The Kakachav Rab Cohen Tzedek, right? It says also this that Israel. So it says when it comes to the night of the seder, right? What you have to have in, the mitzvah to do the mitzvah matzah, there it requires, that it should be baked by a Jew. Like that matzah, l'shem matzah, dichtiv ushmartem et matzot, because it says right in the pasuk, it says in the verse, you should guard the matzot. Ad shimur l'shem matzah. So it has to be guarded for the sake of the mitzvah of matzah. Okay, that's what it says in the Torah. Now he brings another opinion here. So it says the Rav Hai Gaon, right? This Rav Hai, one of the Gaonim, he says, "Katav matzah she'afa akum b'fnei Israel al yedei shimur ketikuna mutar leIsrael leochla u'bale maseh." Right. So he says, if he says like this, right, that if the goy did the baking of the matzah, but the Jew was watching over him, right? In other words, there was a mashgiach there, right? There was a right? So he says, right, that it's allowed to eat that matzah if there was a Jew, guard, like watching over, mashgiach. Okay. So he says, but he says, nevertheless, all right. Right. So he says, but he says the people who are stringent, God fearing, pious people, right? They're stringent about this. So what does that mean? They don't want to eat matzah like this. Okay. So what are we talking about here? We're not talking about for the mitzvah, because for the mitzvah we already established, right, that you can't do that. Here he's talking about the fact that you can just eat it, on Passover, not for the mitzvah, just to eat it during your meals, right? Whatever. So even that, right? He says it's allowed, but right? The really good Jews, right? The hip Jews, the ones that are very cool, right? Very God fearing. Right? I'm joking, but right? Those Jews don't eat that stuff. Okay, good. So it says כגאונים המחמירים ראשים בעצמם באופן כאי דאמינם מה דרכו של עני הוא מסיק לאשתו אופה ולכן so he says right that as we mentioned before, right, last week and whatever before, that the real good Jews, right, the ones who are really God fearing, what they do is they bake it themselves, right, on the eve of Passover, right, as we mentioned, after midday. Okay. So he says, right, that's what it says in the Talmud. It says, what's the way of the poor? That, right, that the guy, does the kneading and his wife bakes it. Lachen, I'm sorry, I didn't say it right. Not that the guy needs the dough. The guy lights the oven, right? He lights it up. In those days, that was quite a job because, it was wood, right? They're using wood. Not just the pressing a button like you do today, right? You press a button, everything is done. No, in those days, they had to start the fire, with the wood, and that's a job. It takes some effort to do that. Uh, like starting a barbecue, but it's even harder than that because today the barbecues are easy. We have lighter fluid and all that stuff, right? But today, in those days, there was no lighter fluid. Had to do it. Okay, so anyway, right? So he lights the oven, and what do you call it, right? And she bakes, ולכן מצווה על כל אדם שישתדל בעשיית מצות ובאפייתן. So it says there is a mitzvah again, right? As we said, that each person should do his own matzah, right? He did his own matzah, right? He's considered to be a mighty man, a pious man, right? If he does that. So, okay, good. So he says, "V'chen היה נוהג אדוני אבי הראש ז"ל." So he says, my father, that's what he did, he says, the tour, that my father, he baked his own matzot, right? Can you imagine a big rabbi like this, Yeah, the big rabbi, he's, became a baker all of a sudden, Oh, gee. Yeah, but there's a mitzvah to do it, so even the big rabbis do it, right? As I told you, Maran, Rav Ovadia Alav Shalom, my rabbi, he used to do it also in his younger days. He would go to the bakery, right? And he would bring like a little bag, a little doggy bag full of flour, and he would bake his own matzot. That's what they did. So there you go, right? Even a big rabbi like that, can you imagine? Like baking his own matzot. But yeah, rabbi, you're too holy for that. You're too, to bake, you're not a baker. Yeah, but for the mitzvah, it's okay. It's there's no problem. Okay. By the way, you see, always, before Passover, like if you look in the Jewish newspapers, in Israel, you see, right, these big rabbis, all of a sudden, like they're wearing that apron, and making their own matzot. It's like, oh, gee, this rabbi, he makes his own matzot. God, isn't he too holy for that? No, I guess not. He's not that holy. He's doing his own thing there. Okay, so we see, right, pictures like that. They always publish them. These big rabbis, with their little right thing, their apron, and their right their shovel, whatever they think they call that thing, right? That takes out, and puts it in. So they have the whole setup there, right? They go to the bakery and they do it over there in the bakery. Usually they don't do it at home. But in theory, you could do that too, just in the bakery, it makes it easier because it's more convenient because the oven is already lit, and whatever. Right. So, and it's already koshered and right, everything is, set to go. So, it makes things easier sometimes. That's the idea. But the truth is, if you kosher your oven, you can make it at home as well, and there's really no problem with that. It's not really so hard to kosher the oven. It's like a half-hour job, Some people spend like 4 or 5 hours in their ovens, I mean, not necessary to do that. In a half hour, you can kosher your oven. Get it ready for Passover. If you want to know how to do it, B'ezras Hashem, I'll tell you. But we're probably going to get to it sooner or later. But whatever. Anyway, we'll talk about that. So yeah, not so hard to do that. So anyway, right, getting back to our discussion here, that the Rosh used to do it also. היה משתדל בהן ועומד על עשייתן ומזרז העוסקים בהן והיה מסייע בעריכתן והיה אדם רגיל לומר על כל פירורין שיפלו בשעת לישה בעריכת יהיו בטלין כדי שיתבטלו קודם החימוצן. So he says, right, that that's what his father did, right? The Rosh, as we said, right? He went and he rolled up his sleeves and he did the job there, right? He was baking there, participating in the baking. He wasn't doing everything, but he was doing something there, whatever, right? Becoming a partner in the baking there. So he says, right, that it's also proper, he says, that if you the person should be accustomed to say if any he says any crumbs fall out, that they should be nullified, because otherwise they could become chametz and could transgress the prohibition of chametz. So yeah, good. That's the tour. Okay, so let's see what we got in the Beit Yosef. Okay. Okay. So says Beit Yosef over here. What's the source for all this, right? All these halachot that we should learn. Adma darko shel ani hu masig. I'm sorry. That's not where it starts. Right. Wait a second. Right. So it says over here. It says Akol bepiskei Rosh. So it says all in the right the Rosh. Perek kol sha'ah over there, right? In this perek, Rav Magid katav beperek hey. Says Rav Magid בשם הרשב"א, name the רשב"א, אם לשע למצה של מצווה גוי או חרש ושוטה קטן. So it says, what about בדיעבד, right? Let's say, right, that matzah, which is for the mitzvah, was needed by a goy, right? Or the other three that we mentioned, right? Deaf, mute, right? Retard, or a child, right? So b'diavad, what's the din? Right? So it says, and what are we talking about here? Even if there was other people like watching them, there was a mashgiach there was a Jewish guy watching over them. Right? Lo yatsa, he didn't fulfill his obligation. So in other words, what we're saying is that, as we said, right, that when it comes to the mitzvah of eating matzah, even b'diavad, you can't fulfill your obligation this way. So that's the way it is. So this rabbi also says it. בשם רביה, name of רביה, ומשמע מדבריו שאם לש ישראל והפך גוי, so it says, it implies from his words that if it was needed by a Jew and then the goy baked it, right, יצא, he did fulfill his obligation. כדברי רבנו חי, like רבנו חי, בתשובות הרשב"א, right, מצאתי, so it says, I found in תשובות הרשב"א, שנשאל על מצה של השח חרש שוטה וקטן, right, regarding a matzah which was needed by these three, right, the guys that we just mentioned, benochri or a goy, ve'eshiv dechevan matzah abayinan shimur. So again, right, it says the same thing. Since we require guarding, for the matzot, for the mitzvah, en adam yilseh b'matzah shel hasha nochri. So therefore, right, if it was needed by a goy, there's no way to fulfill your obligation with the matzah like that. Afilu beisil omed al gabav. Even if the Jew was watching him, right, watching over him, doesn't help. Okay. Umasiro she'echaven l'shem matzah, right? Even if it's telling the goy, have intention, for the mitzvah, make sure you have that in mind, right? Telling the goy, right? So he says, you know why? Because even if you tell the goy that to have, right, the mitzvah in mind, he just did it on he does it on his own volition, he doesn't. He's not going to do the way you want. He does it the way he wants. He's an independent thinker. So he's not gonna, be your little, right, he's not gonna be your little, right, robot, right, or your tuki, your monkey. He's not gonna be like that. He's got his own mind, so he's not gonna do what you want. He's gonna do what he wants. Right, but it says when it comes to these three, right, deaf, mute, and the child, and this, right, retard. Says there we have to discuss that. The perk bet gitin. This is the second perk gitin. Tanan the cheresh shotev katan ksherim lechtov get. He says it says over there that these three categories they are allowed to write a get, right, for divorce, the divorce document. Ve'okimna begadol omed al gabav. So they qualified that in the Talmud and said, "It's what are we talking about? when there's a Jew, right, watching over them. Well, פרק כמה דחולין, right? First פרק of חולין says, בית עמוד א', תנן, וכולם ששחטו ואחרים רואים אותם, שחיטתם כשירה. It's also the same thing when it comes to, right, when it comes to slaughter, right, ritual slaughter, that if the Jew is watching over them and they're doing the slaughtering, right, so it says there that it's kosher. V'aminan Allah, right, what are we talking about? The three, right, that we just mentioned, those three. But I don't think that applies to the goy. But it says we said regarding this in Yud Bet Amud Bet, Man Tana Delo Ba Kavana Bechulin. So who's the Tana, right? The rabbi who holds you don't require intention when it comes to mundane things. Bishchita, when it comes to slaughtering the animal. Ve'okimna Rabbi Natan. So it says Rabbi Natan is the one. Aval Rabbanan, but it says the other rabbis, Shechitatan Psula. They're right. It doesn't work. Right, their slaughter is disqualified. Alma amidal gabehem lo mehania. Right, so you see from there that the fact that you're watching over them doesn't help. Okay, good. V'atosot tiltzu, right? De'acherim ro'im otam shani. So says Tosfot, right, that when other people are watching, there's a mashgiach. It's different. Why? She'en milamedin umazhirin otam lechaven, because they can't really, teach them to have intention. Lemashem osim, right? To regarding what they're doing. Omed al gabehem, like somebody who's standing on top of them, right? The mashgiach. V'adayin kashe. It's a little bit difficult anyway. The mashma de'ena fresh ben cheresh v'katan v'shoteh. So that implies that there's no difference between these three categories that we mentioned. Beget, when it comes to a get, ushchita, and also when it comes to slaughter. Ve'ilo b'charitza mashma, but it says when it comes to charitza, right, which means that releasing the levirate marriage, right, by taking off their shoe, right, whatever, that whole process that they do. The yesh fresh b'neim, there is a difference between them regarding that. But tiltzu the shoter lav bar da'atu. So they answered over there, right, that the Tosfot, that when it comes to retarded person, he has no intellect. הכלל at all, ובדבר שאין לו הוכחה לא מעניין עמידת גדול. So he says regarding something like that, where so somebody watching over him is not going to help you because he has no intellect whatsoever. אגב, כשחיטה וחליצה, just like when it comes to slaughter and חליצה. אבל בגט, when it comes to get though, הואיל ויש בו הוכחת שאומרים לו כתוב לשם פלוני, but since regarding the get, right, writing the divorce document, since there is right, somebody coming and telling him to do it for the sake of the mitzvah. He writes anafshe rami anafshe. So then he accepts that mechaven lishman. So therefore he does actually have the intention at that point. Ma she'enken, not so. Says when it comes to the chalitza and shkita, slaughter. Ulefi divrehem b'matzah. So it says, according to their opinion, when it comes to matzah, the mitzvah, cheresh or shofet katan psulim, right? These three are definitely disqualified for that. Sharet tzricha shimu, because they need to be guarded, right? So it's a different kind of category here. It's a different kind of criterion here. Needs guarding, right? Not with the other things, right? There, we don't have the concept of guarding there. Hashem matzah, right? For the sake of the matzah. Ve'elu hayu omdim acherim al gabehem. So he says, but if somebody was, standing over them, right, mashgiach, so he says, then, right, if you have these three categories, somebody who actually has some intellect, right, it could be that they have kalishta, right, they have some intellect, right, some kind of minimal intellect. So he's not like totally retarded, there's some intellect there. So you can fulfill your obligation, he says. But he says, when it comes to like a total retard, somebody who's like totally retarded. So there, there's nothing you can do. He has no intellect at all. So he says, my rabbi, Rabbeinu Yonah, katav dechol she'efshar al yedei shaliach. So he says, right, that if you can do by way of an agent, get like a get, ushchita and slaughter, kavanata omed al gabav kavanata oseh. Okay, so I guess we'll continue next time. There's still a lot more to cover here. Bezat Hashem, we'll continue next time, and because it's kind of long, and I don't want to. Right, so we'll start from here. Rabbeinu Yonah next time. Bezat Hashem tomorrow. It's not Shabbat yet, right? This time I'm sure. So Bez Hashem, we'll see you tomorrow at 8:30, right? Even though I usually come late, 5 minutes or whatever. I apologize. But anyway, right? I try to be on time. Somehow it doesn't work out for some reason. Okay, thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. You should have a great Passover, Bezat Hashem, everything kosher and right and holy, and sanctify yourself, right, and your families. Laila Tov, Chazak Baruch.
Kabbalah Taraf, thank you so much.
All the best.